She failed the royals. With those 5 words, Zara Tindall shattered years of royal silence and lit a fuse under Meghan Markle's legacy. In a moment no one saw coming, Princess Anne's daughter, Zara Tindall, publicly branded Meghan Markle a failure, live on her husband Mike Tindall's podcast. No palace filters. No press release. Just raw, direct truth from inside the royal bloodline. But what drove Zara to finally break ranks? What happened behind the scenes, and why now? This explosive statement didn't just stir headlines. It may have triggered a new era of royal reckoning. Stay with us as we unpack the words that rocked the monarchy. It was meant to be a lighthearted, family-style podcast. A platform where laughs flowed easily, personal anecdotes were shared freely, and the weight of royal protocol was set aside in favor of something more human, more real. But one sentence changed everything. One moment, buried in the casual rhythm of conversation, turned the podcast from entertainment into an earthquake. It was Zara Tindall, Princess Anne's fiercely private daughter, who looked across the microphone, steady-eyed and unflinching, and said what millions had whispered for years: Meghan failed us. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. The world stopped. At least, the royal watching world did. It was the first time a core royal, someone born of the blood, untethered by titles, and unconcerned with media spin, openly voiced what had until then only been implied, editorialized, or denied. The message wasn't dressed in metaphor. There was no diplomatic dance. Zara Tindall didn't offer shade, she turned on a spotlight. Her words didn't just break a silence, they ripped a veil wide open, revealing fractures in the monarchy's most carefully maintained facade. And she did it not through an official statement or a palace-sanctioned interview, but on her husband Mike Tindall's podcast, a show known for its laid-back energy, offbeat humor, and complete lack of royal censorship. That contrast made the moment all the more explosive. Zara wasn't performing. She wasn't reading a script. She was, for once, speaking as a woman, a mother, a royal by blood, and a bystander who had watched her family endure years of division, distraction, and damage. So why did she say it now? Why did Zara, who had stayed silent through Meghan's Oprah interview, through the Netflix documentary, through Harry's memoir, finally decide to speak? To understand the weight of her words, we have to go back. Not just to the podcast episode itself, but to the years of quiet frustration and restrained reactions. Because Zara didn't just wake up and call Meghan a failure. That verdict had been forming for a long time. And now, for the first time, we can trace its origin, follow its rise, and explore its impact on the family, on the public, and on the woman it was aimed at. This is not another celebrity gossip piece. This is a story about one of the most influential families in modern history, one bound by tradition, fractured by rebellion, and caught between the image it must maintain and the truths it can no longer hide. And right at the center is a woman whom many thought would be the symbol of progress in the royal family, but who now finds herself being described, publicly, as a failure. So let's rewind to that moment. It was a Thursday afternoon. The latest episode of The Good, the Bad, and the Rugby podcast had just gone live. Hosted by Mike Tindall and 2 of his longtime friends, the show had been climbing the charts thanks to its unfiltered take on life, sport, and family. But this episode had something extra. Zara Tindall had joined as a special guest. It wasn't the first time she had appeared, but it was the first time she was front and center, speaking more freely than anyone expected. The conversation started innocently enough: recollections of childhood mischief, horseback riding stories, royal holiday gatherings. Then came a subtle shift. The hosts moved into a discussion about family legacy, the importance of unity, and the pressures that come with public life. That's when Mike turned to Zara and asked, with a half-smile, "Do you think the family's been through the worst of it now?" Zara paused. For a few seconds, she said nothing. Then, with uncharacteristic calm, she leaned forward and replied, "It depends on whether you count Meghan as part of the worst. Because if we're honest, she's been a failure to the royals. That's not cruel. That's just fact." Silence. Mike blinked. The other co-host glanced at the producer. No one laughed. No one rescued the moment with a joke. Zara wasn't angry. She wasn't bitter. She was factual. Detached. Like someone delivering an overdue performance review, not out of malice, but necessity. Within hours, clips from the podcast had flooded social media. The royal press corps scrambled. Headlines flared. Public reactions split. Some hailed Zara as brave, finally voicing what so many inside the palace had kept bottled up. Others accused her of betrayal, arguing that royal family members should rise above public criticism, even when under pressure. But what almost no one could deny was the impact. For years, Meghan Markle had commanded global attention. From her wedding to Harry to her shocking interviews, her narrative had driven headlines. She positioned herself as the royal reformer, the one who challenged dusty traditions, modernized stiff protocol, and exposed the monarchy's inner dysfunction. But now, her image had been directly challenged from within, not by tabloids, not by royal biographers, but by someone who actually lived it. A blood royal. A family member. A peer. The implications were massive. Suddenly, questions were flying. Was this a one-off comment? Or was Zara speaking on behalf of a larger, silent faction within the firm? How long had these sentiments been shared behind closed doors? What did William think? Kate? Charles? And what about Meghan herself? How would she respond? More importantly, what exactly had Meghan failed at? Was it her duty to the crown? Her relationships with the family? Her promises to the public? Or was the failure something more personal, something Zara had witnessed firsthand at family gatherings, in private meetings, in the long, awkward silences that now defined royal reunions? In the chapters ahead, we'll dive deep into each of those questions. We'll examine Zara's unique position within the royal hierarchy, a woman born to the bloodline, but never crowned with a title. A woman who straddles the public and private spheres better than almost anyone in the family. Someone who, perhaps more than anyone, has earned the right to speak freely because she's never sought fame or favor. She is, in many ways, the royal family's hidden compass. We'll also explore Meghan's trajectory, from Hollywood to Windsor, from Duchess to exile, in the pivotal moments where things began to fall apart. Because if Zara's words were harsh, they weren't baseless. They were forged in years of tension, broken expectations, and a growing divide that no palace press release could repair. But make no mistake, this isn't just a story about Zara or Meghan. It's about the monarchy itself, the unwritten rules, the silent wars, the invisible battles fought not with weapons, but with words, decisions, and allegiances. It's about what happens when someone tries to rewrite the rules without first learning the script, and what happens when someone who does know the script finally decides to call it out. This video will take you behind the scenes of that bombshell moment and through the rooms where history was quietly unfolding long before it reached the headlines. Because Zara's words were not the beginning of the story. They were the turning point. And everything from here on out changes. To truly understand the weight behind Zara Tindall's words, the blunt assessment that Meghan Markle had failed the royals, you first have to understand Zara herself. Because Zara is not just another royal voice joining the chorus. She is, in many ways, the monarchy's secret stabilizer, a woman who grew up within the most watched family in the world, yet somehow remained untouched by its more toxic patterns. She is both insider and outsider, royal by blood, but never constrained by the burden of a title, a bridge between duty and normalcy. And it's that very balance that makes her judgment all the more powerful. Zara and Elizabeth Tindall was born on May 15, 1981, the daughter of Princess and Captain Mark Phillips. From birth, she was surrounded by the trappings of royalty, the castles, the ceremonies, the press. But unlike her cousins, Zara never held a royal title. Her mother made a deliberate choice to reject one, believing that the pressure of royal duty would hinder her children's ability to live freely. It was a decision that changed everything. While her cousins grew up with the world watching their every move, Zara was allowed to run barefoot in the gardens, ride horses without photographers trailing her, and experience life with a degree of privacy that most royals could only dream of. But being untitled didn't mean Zara was disconnected. Quite the opposite. She was at every major royal event, standing alongside William and Harry at Diana's funeral, attending Trooping the Colour, celebrating jubilees, and holidaying at Balmoral. She was part of the family fabric, present, observant, and never one to draw unnecessary attention. While others in the firm played politics, Zara built a reputation for being grounded, respectful, and quietly competent. Her passion for equestrian sports became her calling card. As a world-class rider, Zara not only competed at the highest level, she excelled. In 2006, she was voted BBC Sports Personality of the Year. In 2012, she won a silver medal as part of the British equestrian team at the London Olympics. Queen Elizabeth II herself awarded Zara the medal. That image, of grandmother and granddaughter sharing a quiet, proud moment, was a symbol of a different kind of royalty, one based on merit, not media. But even as Zara rose in her sporting career, she remained tethered to her royal roots. She was frequently present at major family gatherings. Her relationships with William and Harry were especially close in their younger years. She was often described as the fun cousin, the one who could make the princes laugh during stuffy events and offer honest advice when palace pressure became too much. But she was also fiercely loyal. She understood discretion, and unlike so many others, she never tried to capitalize on her connection to the crown. That's what made her recent comment so jarring. For someone who had spent decades steering clear of controversy, Zara's decision to speak candidly on Mike's podcast was not made lightly. It signaled a shift, a moment when her personal experiences and private frustrations finally broke through her usual restraint. And while it may have shocked the public, those close to the family weren't entirely surprised. Behind the scenes, Zara had long been one of the most trusted figures within the royal circle. Her mother, Princess Anne, is famously no-nonsense. That trait was passed down directly. Zara doesn't deal in gossip or sentiment. She values action, integrity, and consistency. And it's precisely those values that were tested as she watched the chaos surrounding Meghan unfold over the years. She had been there at the wedding, had smiled politely, had welcomed Meghan with cautious optimism. But it didn't take long for her to notice the fractures. Meghan wasn't like the others, not just because of her background, but because of her behavior. Her entrance into the royal family was marked not by adaptation, but resistance. Protocols were questioned. Family traditions were challenged. And, according to multiple insiders, tensions rose quickly behind closed doors. Zara observed it all, quietly, without press statements or podcast rants. But she saw it. She saw Meghan reportedly skip out on prearranged photo ops, creating last-minute changes that sent royal planners into a spiral. She saw how family events became tense, how conversations turned into confrontations, how certain members of the family began retreating emotionally to avoid the constant volatility. Zara, ever the realist, reportedly made it her mission to keep things smooth. But even she had her limits. Those limits were reached not at the wedding, not during the Netflix documentary, but in the aftermath of Meghan and Harry's media tour, especially during the Oprah interview. Zara, like many in the family, reportedly felt blindsided. She watched as Meghan accused the institution she had joined of cruelty, racism, and deliberate neglect. And while Zara believed in accountability, she also believed in fairness. There's criticism. One friend of Zara's recalled her saying privately, and then there's sabotage. That wasn't an interview. That was demolition. From that point on, Zara's patience began to erode. It wasn't just the public attacks that bothered her. It was the rewriting of history. Meghan's version of events often clashed with the memories of those who were actually present. Moments that had once seemed small, disagreements over seating arrangements, confusion over tiaras, minor spats during rehearsals, were suddenly being broadcast as evidence of deep family dysfunction. For Zara, who had watched the Queen weather global crises without complaint, this felt like a betrayal of the family's unwritten code: protect each other, even when it's hard. And yet, even in her frustration, Zara stayed silent. She didn't comment when Harry released Spare. She didn't speak out during Meghan's Spotify partnership meltdown. She didn't leak anything to the press. She simply watched, waited, measured, until she no longer could. The decision to speak on Mike's podcast wasn't about fame or relevance. Zara already had both on her own terms. It was, instead, about setting the record straight, about defending a family that had taken blow after blow, often without responding. It was about pointing out the obvious, that Meghan's choices had caused real damage, that the path she took, regardless of her intentions, did not lead to unity, but division. And for Zara, who values loyalty above all else, that made her a failure in the one role that mattered most: family. In that moment on the podcast, Zara wasn't just speaking for herself. She was speaking for the cousins who had held their tongues, for the aunts and uncles who had been mischaracterized, for the Queen, who had passed without ever offering public rebuttal, for the institution that had been battered and bruised, yet endured. Her statement was a culmination of years of watching, absorbing, and silently enduring the fallout. And when she finally spoke, she didn't raise her voice. She didn't dramatize. She simply told the truth as she saw it. And the world listened. Because when someone who never speaks out finally does, people pay attention. When most people think of Mike Tindall, The image that comes to mind is that of the affable ex-rugby champion with a quick grin and a relaxed presence. A man with zero interest in royal ceremony and all the warmth of a favorite pub mate. To some, he's just Zara's husband, an outsider welcomed into the royal fold. To others, he's carved out a space entirely his own, one foot in tradition, the other in total freedom. But what many didn't expect was that Mike would create one of the most unexpectedly impactful media platforms in recent royal history, a casual podcast that, ironically, delivered one of the monarchy's most disruptive truths. The good, the bad, and the rugby started as a passion project. Mike and his co-hosts, James Haskell and Alex Payne, launched it as a space for behind-the-scenes sports talk, life commentary, and humor. At first, it seemed innocuous enough. Sports fans tuned in. Royal watchers barely noticed. But it didn't take long for the show to evolve. As the audience grew, so did its scope. Suddenly, it was more than just jokes about changing room banter or tournament trivia. It became a window into real conversations with real people, some of whom just happened to be closely linked to royalty. Mike was the key. His status as a former international rugby star gave him public recognition, but it was his authenticity that made listeners stay. He didn't pretend. He didn't pander. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. And unlike most figures connected to the royal family, he didn't live in fear of headlines. That freedom became the backbone of the podcast's identity. Over time, guests ranged from fellow athletes to comedians to mental health experts, and occasionally, royal family members. There was a refreshing lack of pretense in the way conversations flowed. Nothing was too polished. Nothing felt rehearsed. And that's precisely what gave the show its unique edge. It wasn't trying to be influential, which, ironically, made it all the more powerful when it accidentally became exactly that. Enter Zara Tindall. She had made guest appearances on the podcast before, usually sitting beside Mike with a quiet smile and the kind of relaxed presence that only comes from years of avoiding public scandal. Listeners enjoyed her calm energy, her dry wit, her unwillingness to perform. She didn't play the fame game, and that was the charm. But when she returned for the now infamous episode, recorded in a relaxed setting with the usual crew, there was something different in the air. The conversation that day had begun, as always, with lighthearted talk, rugby anecdotes, parenting woes, jokes about domestic chores. It was the kind of setup that lulled listeners into comfort. But then the topic shifted, subtly but unmistakably. They started discussing family, unity, the concept of resilience. Mike asked, in an offhand tone, how the family had coped with the stormy years. Zara's face changed. Not dramatically. Just a slight hardening of the jaw, a quiet breath drawn a little deeper than usual. And then she said it. It depends on whether you count Meghan as part of the worst. Because if we're honest, she's been a failure to the royals. That's not cruel. That's just fact. It didn't land like a bomb. It landed like a freeze. Mike didn't interrupt. He didn't try to soften it. He didn't change the subject. Instead, there was a beat of silence, followed by a hesitant, wow, and then a gentle prompt. Want to explain what you mean by that? And she did. What made the moment remarkable was its setting. This wasn't a formal interview. There were no TV crews, no lighting directors, no media handlers. Just a woman, sitting across from her husband and friends, speaking plainly. That context is what gave the words their power. If Zara had issued the same statement in a newspaper column or a primetime interview, the impact would have been diluted by format. But on the podcast, it felt raw, candid, unfiltered. And Mike, whether consciously or not, allowed it to happen. He didn't frame it as gossip. He didn't cut her off. He gave space. That subtle decision transformed his show from entertainment into something historically significant. It became the platform on which a senior royal aired a long-simmering truth the palace had never dared say aloud. What's especially interesting is that this wasn't the first time Mike's podcast had veered into serious territory. He and his co-hosts had previously discussed mental health, family dynamics, and personal struggles in a way that felt strikingly open for a media environment built on stiff upper lips. Listeners had already come to trust that the good, the bad, and the rugby could handle depth with care. That's what made Zara's comment feel less like a cheap shot and more like a hard-earned truth. But make no mistake, this wasn't accidental. Though Mike may seem like the fun uncle of the royal clan, he's no fool. He knows how media works. He knows how quotes get clipped, spun, and weaponized. The fact that he aired the episode without edits, without disclaimers, And without damage control suggests one thing: he stood by his wife. He let the words stay because they needed to be said. And in doing so, he positioned the podcast, not a press briefing, not a BBC interview, not a palace leak, as the unlikely forum for the biggest royal statement of the year. It was a turning point. Almost overnight, the show's audience exploded. Not just in the UK, but internationally. Clips from the episode circulated across social platforms. Hashtags trended. Commentators weighed in. And amidst it all, Mike stayed quiet. No clarifying posts. No follow-up statements. No apologies. His silence was deafening and, to many, deeply strategic. It sent a clear message. This wasn't a PR stunt. This wasn't a trap. It was truth. And the truth was this: someone within the royal family had finally broken rank, not to stir drama, but to put words to a quiet consensus. Meghan Markle, once hailed as the breath of fresh air, had become, in the eyes of many within the firm, a source of chaos. And now, the reckoning had begun. Not with fanfare, not with fury, but with calm, measured honesty delivered on a rugby podcast by a woman who had kept her silence for too long. That podcast episode didn't just mark a shift in royal dynamics. It redefined the media battleground. No longer was the palace the only stage for royal commentary. No longer were the tabloids or Netflix the sole lens through which the public would view these figures. The line between personal platforms and national history had blurred, and Mike Tindall's podcast was now part of that history. In the weeks that followed, analysts began reevaluating the show's influence. Media outlets scoured past episodes for other buried insights. Public trust in the podcast soared, not because of production value, but because it offered something few royal-adjacent platforms ever had: unvarnished truth. And at the center of it all stood Mike and Zara, accidental revolutionaries, or perhaps something more intentional. A couple using a simple platform to say what everyone else was too afraid to say. Because sometimes, it's not the crown that delivers the blow. Sometimes, it's the people just outside the frame, the ones with nothing to prove and everything to protect. It wasn't the kind of statement anyone expected to hear on a podcast about rugby. But that was part of the power. It came from nowhere, unannounced, woven into a casual conversation about family, legacy, and loyalty. One line, one moment, and then the entire royal narrative shifted. Zara Tindall sat upright in her seat, her tone calm, her eyes unwavering. And then she said it: if we're honest, she's been a failure to the royals. That's not cruel. That's just fact. Within hours, that sentence was being replayed across the world. From London to Los Angeles, royal correspondents dropped what they were doing. Major media outlets published headlines in real time. Zara breaks royal silence, read one. Meghan branded a failure by the Queen's granddaughter, another. Talk shows dissected the quote. Social media turned it into a viral soundbite. Analysts scrambled to interpret it. And somewhere in Montecito, Meghan Markle, too, must have hit play and heard the words that would become impossible to ignore. But the moment didn't go viral because it was loud or outrageous. It went viral because it was the opposite: quiet, poised, and devastatingly honest. Zara didn't raise her voice. She didn't laugh. She didn't use metaphors or hide behind vague sentiment. There was no anger, no dramatics. She said it like she was reading out a weather report. Factual, steady, almost surgical in its simplicity. But the emotional weight behind the sentence landed with a thud that could be felt far beyond the podcast studio. And yet, the moment wasn't over. Mike, to his credit, didn't pivot away. He looked at her, not shocked, not concerned, but curious. You want to explain what you mean by that? He asked. Zara nodded. And then she added. She came in with an opportunity most people dream of. To do real work, to bring change from the inside. But instead of building, she broke things. Instead of connecting, she divided. And whether she meant to or not, the result is the same. That's failure. Silence again. The podcast didn't cut to a commercial break. No one edited the comment out. It was left there, raw, unfiltered. For a royal family that traditionally operates behind heavy velvet curtains, where everything from posture to eye movement is rehearsed and monitored, this was uncharted territory. A direct message, not to Meghan alone, but to the entire public. The most striking thing? Zara wasn't ranting. She wasn't trying to trend. She was simply telling her truth out loud for once. The hosts allowed the moment to breathe. James Haskell and Alex Payne, clearly aware of the bombshell, chose not to drown it in humor or move along. Mike offered no apology on her behalf. It wasn't needed. For the first time in years, someone with a real last name and a real seat at the royal table was saying what so many inside and outside the palace had whispered in private. But what exactly made this moment so disruptive? First, consider the source. Zara Tindall has never chased fame. She's not a tabloid regular. She hasn't sold her story. She hasn't joined a streaming service or published a memoir. She lives largely outside the royal spotlight, not because she was banished, but because she chose it. So when she speaks, especially about family, it's not seen as opportunistic. It's seen as real. That authenticity lent her words a gravity no commentator or outsider could replicate. Second, consider the timing. The royal family had spent years trying to manage the fallout from Meghan and Harry's explosive choices. From the Oprah interview to the Netflix documentary, to the publication of Spare, the institution had taken hit after hit. And while aides behind the scenes scrambled to patch the cracks, the firm remained publicly silent. Never complained, never explained the Queen's doctrine had become both shield and burden. But now, with Queen Elizabeth gone, and King Charles navigating a monarchy in flux, the space for honesty widened. And it was Zara who stepped into it, not with malice, but with clarity. She wasn't undermining the family. She was defending it. Third, consider the impact. The public had grown weary of the endless back and forth, weary of being told who was right and who was wrong, weary of slick productions and staged narratives. Zara's comment cut through all of that. It wasn't part of a PR campaign. It wasn't part of a book tour. It was a sentence that landed because it was spoken by someone who had everything to lose and nothing to gain. The global reaction was swift. In the UK, the clip dominated news segments. On social media, hashtags erupted. Hashtag Zara speaks. Hashtag royal truth. Hashtag failure to the royals. Opinion pieces flooded major outlets, some applauding Zara for her candor, others criticizing her for going public. The Guardian called it the most honest moment from a royal in the last decade. The Daily Mail branded it a public reckoning long overdue. Across the Atlantic, American media responded with a mix of shock and skepticism. Meghan's supporters rallied in defense, calling Zara's words a calculated attack. Hollywood circles speculated whether the moment would prompt Meghan to break her silence again. But regardless of perspective, the moment had everyone watching. And that's when the ripple effects began inside the firm itself. According to palace insiders, the comment wasn't discussed at a family-wide emergency meeting, but it didn't need to be. Phones lit up. Group chats buzzed. Private calls were made. William, reportedly, remained outwardly neutral, but sources say he viewed Zara's statement as brave. Princess, and characteristically silent, was said to have nodded approvingly when asked if she'd heard the clip. King Charles issued no comment, but aides close to him admitted that the remark had echoed a feeling many inside the palace had struggled to articulate. The Queen consort, Camilla, reportedly told a confidant, "It was bound to come out. Better from Zara than from someone with an agenda." Inside Montecito, the mood was said to be less composed. Meghan was reportedly blindsided, not just by the comment, but by who it came from. Zara had never been considered an enemy. In fact, Meghan had often described her as one of the easier royals to be around. Her silence had been interpreted as neutrality. But now that silence was broken, and it came not with fury, but finality. The fallout was not just emotional, it was reputational. For Meghan, the carefully constructed narrative of being wronged by the system was suddenly facing resistance not from the press, but from the people who had once welcomed her into their homes. For the royal family, the age of silence was beginning to end. Zara's words opened a door, and no one knew what, or who, might come through next. What made the moment so unforgettable wasn't just the line itself. It was what it represented, a reckoning, years in the making. A line in the sand drawn by someone who had no interest in drama, no need for fame, and no fear of backlash. Zara Tindall had spoken, and the monarchy would never sound the same again. By the time Zara Tindall uttered the now infamous line that Meghan Markle had failed the royals, it wasn't a sudden outburst or a one-off opinion. It was the release valve on years of tightly contained frustration. A deeply personal, quiet fury cultivated over countless moments. Some subtle, others glaring, that began the day Meghan entered the royal family and steadily built to the point where silence became no longer tolerable. Zara, unlike many members of the firm, doesn't wear frustration on her sleeve. She doesn't do passive aggression. She is, by all accounts, emotionally disciplined. Raised under the formidable watch of Princess and a woman known for her steel nerves, duty-first ethos, and zero-tolerance approach to theatrics, Zara learned early on to contain emotion in public, maintain discretion, and never use her surname to gain favor. She operated from a place of personal integrity and family loyalty. But when Meghan arrived, that equilibrium was disrupted in ways that never truly repaired. It began with the wedding. In May 2018, the royal family gathered for the grand spectacle that was Prince Harry and Meghan Markle's nuptials. Zara, heavily pregnant at the time, arrived with Mike and the rest of the Tindalls. She smiled politely, stood through the ceremony with grace, and offered the appropriate nods. But even then, observers later reported that Zara's expression during parts of the service seemed uneasy. Some speculated it was due to discomfort from pregnancy. Others, now with hindsight, wonder if she sensed what others didn't dare say, that this wasn't just a wedding. It was the start of a fracture. In the weeks that followed, Zara was among the few who extended an olive branch to Meghan. Despite their different backgrounds, Zara the equestrian country girl, Meghan the cosmopolitan actress, they had shared interests in health, fitness, and children. For a brief moment, there was hope that they'd find common ground. And for a while, they tried. Zara reportedly invited Meghan to equestrian events, offered advice on handling media scrutiny, and even sent baby gifts well before Archie's arrival. But there was one problem. Meghan didn't reciprocate. Zara was used to straight talk. Meghan, in contrast, mastered the subtle art of selective engagement, smiling in public, disappearing in private. According to palace insiders, Zara began to notice that Meghan avoided gatherings that weren't centered on her. She'd arrive late, leave early, and rarely showed interest in the extended family unless cameras were rolling. That didn't sit well with someone who had spent her entire life honoring family traditions without needing attention for doing so. The real tipping point, however, came in 2019, shortly after Archie's birth. Zara had hoped that motherhood might bridge the divide. She even reached out directly to offer postnatal advice, drawing from her own experiences with her daughters, Mia and Lena. Meghan was polite, but distant. When Zara suggested meeting for tea at her Gloucestershire estate, away from press, cameras, or palace chatter, Meghan reportedly declined, citing scheduling issues. A second offer was ignored entirely. It wasn't just the rejection. It was the implication that Zara, despite being a blood royal, wasn't important enough. That her guidance, her presence, her position within the family structure held no real value to Meghan. It was a slight that Zara never forgot. Then came the Fab Ford disaster. Zara had watched Harry and William grow up side by side, more brothers than cousins. She had seen them navigate grief, scandal, and duty together. For years, she served as a buffer between them, someone both could talk to without judgment. When Meghan entered the picture, Zara tried to support the evolving dynamic. But it became clear, quickly, that the new Duchess wasn't interested in the same kind of balance. According to a close friend of Zara's, there were several private dinners in which Meghan dominated conversation, steered discussions back to herself, and dismissed any mention of traditional royal protocols as outdated. Zara, who had always believed that quiet service meant more than performance, found it off-putting. At one event, when Meghan jokingly referred to royal rules as Victorian nonsense, Zara responded, not with laughter, but with a sharp look and one simple sentence: "It's nonsense that's held this family together for centuries." Tension simmered beneath the surface from that moment on. But it wasn't just about differing values. It was about how Meghan weaponized public narrative. When the Oprah interview aired, Zara was watching. Like the rest of the family, she was caught off guard by the timing and contents. But while the headlines focused on Meghan's statements about racism and mental health, Zara fixated on something else: the blatant rewriting of events. Zara had been present during many of the tense royal gatherings Meghan referenced. She knew the tone of those conversations. She knew who said what. And she knew when facts had been twisted to fit a more dramatic narrative. To watch Meghan reduce those moments to painful, curated anecdotes felt like betrayal. Not just of the family, but of the truth. One of Zara's closest confidants later shared what she said after watching the interview. "She's not just telling her story. She's selling a version of it where everyone else is the villain. And we don't get to respond. We don't do that. We never have." And that's what gnawed at Zara more than anything: the lack of accountability. While the rest of the royal family maintained composure in the face of relentless public criticism, Meghan and Harry leveraged every grievance into headlines and deals. Zara watched as silence was misinterpreted as guilt, as loyalty was seen as weakness, as the family's restraint was painted as cruelty. It wasn't just public perception at stake, it was personal dignity. Over time, Zara began to withdraw from any situation involving Meghan. She skipped private dinners when the Sussexes were in town. She declined interviews where Meghan's name might be brought up. She focused on her family, her equestrian career, and her husband's podcast. But the resentment built slowly, quietly, until the podcast episode offered an unexpected moment of catharsis. The words she finally spoke, "She's been a failure to the royals," weren't delivered in a fit of rage. They were the culmination of years of being dismissed, sidelined, and misrepresented. They were an audit, not of character, but of contribution. In Zara's view, Meghan had every opportunity to be a force for good. She had a platform, a global audience, and the admiration of a modernizing royal family ready to evolve. But instead of building trust, she built walls. Instead of learning the system, she sought to dismantle it, without offering anything more sustainable in its place. Zara didn't speak out because she hated Meghan. She spoke out because the silence had become dishonest. Because pretending that everything was fine was no longer an option. Because someone had to say what so many inside the family had whispered for years. And because, at the end of the day, Zara believed that being royal, whether titled or not, meant something. It meant showing up, honoring commitments, respecting history, and protecting the institution even when it hurt. Meghan hadn't done that. And to Zara, that wasn't just disappointing. It was failure. When Zara Tindall's words went live on her husband's podcast, the effect within the royal family was not immediate chaos, it was silence. A sharp, chilling silence. Not the silence of indifference, but the kind that happens just before a storm. For a family that has thrived for centuries on internal code, carefully measured statements, and an unspoken vow to never let private matters slip into public discourse, Zara's declaration was seismic. It wasn't just what she said. It was the fact that she said it at all. The royal family has always maintained a fragile equilibrium built on mutual discretion. Even in times of great internal rift, divorces, abdications, affairs, the public statements have remained formal, devoid of emotion. Members of the firm are taught from childhood to absorb pressure and never reflect it. So when a core member of the family openly criticized Meghan Markle, without the veil of metaphor or euphemism, it shattered a sacred royal rule: protect the family, even when it's hard. And yet, to many inside the firm, Zara hadn't betrayed the code. She had defended it. Behind palace doors, reactions ranged from stunned silence to quiet approval. Some felt vindicated, others blindsided, but no one remained unaffected. According to senior staff at Clarence House and Kensington Palace, private calls between royal households began almost immediately after the episode aired. Not in an official capacity, but quietly, through personal assistants, long-trusted advisors, and those who serve as informal messengers between the family members. The goal wasn't to coordinate a response. It was to feel out the atmosphere. Who was outraged? Who was nodding quietly in agreement? Let's start with the king. Charles III, who had spent the last few years trying to present a modern, inclusive monarchy while simultaneously managing personal heartbreak and institutional stability, reportedly received news of Zara's statement from his private secretary during breakfast. His reaction, according to sources, was not anger, but reflection. He didn't call Zara. He didn't summon his advisors into a war room. Instead, he read a transcript of her words in silence, then simply said, "She's not the first to feel this way. She's just the first to say it." That comment, shared later with a confidant, revealed everything. Charles understood the gravity of the situation, but he also understood the truth behind Zara's frustration. He had lived through the same tension, had witnessed the same unraveling. Meghan's exit had cost him not just a daughter-in-law, but a son's loyalty, a stable media front, and years of carefully cultivated institutional goodwill. The idea that someone had finally voiced the discontent so many within the family felt, it didn't offend him. It relieved him. At Kensington Palace, Prince William was less composed. According to aides, William's immediate response to the podcast was physical, pacing across the floor of his private study, headphones still in, muttering under his breath. He reportedly paused the recording 3 times to re-listen to Zara's delivery, as if trying to determine whether it was calculated or spontaneous. A senior staff member who witnessed the scene described his expression as a blend of shock and something close to respect. While William has never publicly condemned his brother or Meghan, those closest to him say the damage has been done for years. The Oprah interview, the Netflix docuseries, the Spare memoir. Each piece of public content from Harry and Meghan had landed like a blow to his sense of loyalty, family, and truth. And through it all, William had kept quiet, declining interview requests, deflecting questions, and focusing on his role as heir. Zara's comment, then, was something he never expected, but perhaps welcomed more than he let on. He didn't issue a statement. He didn't reach out to Meghan, but he did call Zara. The conversation, according to a mutual friend, was brief but powerful. William thanked her, not for attacking Meghan, but for being honest. He reportedly said, "There's been too much silence for too long. You were brave." At Windsor, the Queen Consort Camilla's reaction was characteristically restrained. She read the transcript over her morning tea, nodded slowly, and carried on with her engagements. But aides revealed that later that afternoon, she remarked to a close friend, "Well, someone finally said it." That offhand comment made its way back through palace circles, interpreted not as mockery, but affirmation. Princess and Zara's mother was the only member of the family who knew beforehand that the comment was coming. According to an insider familiar with the Tindall household, Zara had mentioned to, and that she planned to be candid on the podcast. And, never one to dissuade plain speaking, reportedly offered her blessing with one caveat: say it because it's true, not because you want applause. When the episode aired, and issued no comment. She didn't need to. Her silence, as always, was strategic. But within her tight circle, she was described as proud. She had raised her daughter to be strong, discerning, and loyal to the core. Zara's words may have disrupted public decorum, but in Anne's world, honesty spoken calmly was a mark of maturity, not rebellion. Elsewhere in the family, reactions varied. Prince Edward and Sophie, the Duke and Duchess of Edinburgh, reportedly remained neutral. Close to both Charles and William, they had always walked a tightrope between keeping the peace and avoiding the press. Sophie, who had once tried to bridge the gap between Meghan and the rest of the family during her early days, was said to be disappointed in how things turned out but understood Zara's frustration. Edward, ever the quiet observer, declined to comment even privately. Among the younger royals, Beatrice, Eugenie, Lady Louise, there was a generational divide. Beatrice and Eugenie, who had maintained cordial ties with Meghan and Harry even after the royal split, were reportedly concerned about the statement. A friend of the sisters revealed, they've always believed in loyalty to family but not at the expense of peace. They didn't refute Zara's words, but they did worry about the implications for future relationships. Lady Louise, still in her early 20s, reportedly saw Zara's comment as truthful and not cruel. Her reaction was more observational than emotional, a sign of how the younger generation is both informed by and detached from the institution's strict public image. But perhaps the most emotionally raw fallout came from Harry himself. Inside Montecito, according to multiple reports, Harry was devastated. While his relationship with Zara had cooled over the years, he had once considered her one of his closest cousins, someone he could trust, someone who wouldn't betray him, even if she didn't agree with him. Her public statement felt like a line had been crossed, a family tie severed. He reportedly called his father shortly after the podcast went viral, asking, "Did you know she was going to say that?" Charles's answer, quiet, measured, was simply, "She spoke for herself." Meghan, for her part, was more strategic. Sources close to her said she was furious but composed. She considered the statement defamatory, but was advised against responding directly. There was talk of a strongly worded letter to Mike's podcast team, but ultimately, nothing was sent. Meghan chose silence, knowing that public confrontation could backfire. Still, behind the scenes, trust had been broken, perhaps irreparably. What Zara had done was not just speak her truth. She had triggered a silent recalibration within the royal family. Every member now knew that the rules had changed. That silence, once considered the ultimate expression of dignity, might now be seen as complicity. That telling the truth, even when it was uncomfortable, could be an act of service. But the question lingered, what happens next? Would other royals follow Zara's lead? Would more voices rise, speaking of their own grievances, their own truths? Or would the family retreat once again into the comfort of silence? For now, the answer remained unclear. But one thing was certain. The old way was over. Zara's words didn't just land with force. They landed with finality. A declaration that the age of curated stories and passive tolerance had reached its limit. The fallout was real, and it was still unfolding. When Zara Tindall's words began dominating headlines, Meghan Markle was hundreds of miles away from the palace walls, secluded behind the manicured hedges and guarded gates of her Montecito estate. But distance did little to soften the impact. If anything, it magnified it. Because for the first time since stepping away from royal duties, Meghan was no longer being criticized by tabloids or unnamed palace sources. She was being called out directly, by name, by reputation, and by someone born into the very family Meghan had once tried to reform from the inside. And she knew instantly. This wasn't something she could ignore. The first time Meghan reportedly heard the comment was not through a news alert or staff member. A friend texted her a link to a social media post with the caption, "You need to see this." It was a clipped version of Zara's statement, under a minute long, looping endlessly across Instagram Reels, TikTok trends, and Twitter threads. Meghan pressed play, expecting another media twist, another unfounded rumor. Instead, she heard Zara's voice, clear, calm, and undeniable. "She's been a failure to the royals." Meghan froze. Those in her immediate circle said she watched the video 5 times before saying a word. Doria Ragland, who was at the house when it happened, tried to offer comfort, but Meghan reportedly held up a hand and said, "Don't. I need to think." And then, she went silent. For hours, Meghan didn't speak to her team. No calls, no messages, no meetings. She canceled a scheduled Zoom with her lifestyle brand advisors and postponed a planned charity announcement. According to one household staff member, she shut everything down, just went completely quiet. That silence wasn't grief. It was strategy. Meghan Markle had built an entire post-royal brand on image control. Her public persona, graceful, composed, misunderstood but resilient, depended on keeping her narrative clean and compelling. Every interview, every appearance, every carefully worded message had been calculated to maintain that image. But Zara's comment couldn't be spun. It wasn't vague or dismissive. It was a blunt statement from someone with no tabloid ties and no apparent reason to stir drama. It wasn't just damaging, it was difficult to discredit. Meghan's initial instinct, according to insiders, was to respond, not through social media or an interview, but via a formal statement issued by her legal team. The draft response was said to read, "The Duchess of Sussex is disappointed to hear that a member of the royal family would use a public platform to issue personal attacks. The comment made on the podcast is untrue, unfair, and undermines the very values of dignity and discretion the monarchy is supposed to represent." But after 2 days of internal debate, that draft was shelved. Meghan reportedly realized what Zara had said wasn't technically untrue in a legal sense. It was an opinion, and a protected one at that. Worse, issuing a rebuttal could escalate the situation into a full-blown family war in the press, something Meghan's brand could not withstand. So she chose what she believed was the smarter path, silence. But that silence was filled with fire. Behind closed doors, Meghan was said to be livid. How dare she? She reportedly told one confidant, "I've never said a word about her. Not once." She viewed Zara's comment as not only unjustified but deliberately cruel. To Meghan, she had endured extraordinary emotional hardship within the royal system. She had fought back against racism, isolation, and public hate. She believed she had done her best, protected her mental health, her children, and even the monarchy from worse fallout by leaving when she did. To be branded a failure, after all that, felt like betrayal, especially from someone she considered distant but respectful. According to a former staff member who worked with Meghan during her first year as a duchess, Zara was one of the few she didn't fear. Meghan always said she was one of the quiet ones, the safe ones. That perception made the comment all the more wounding. But there was another layer to Meghan's reaction, a deeper one tied not to the words themselves, but to their ripple effect. Zara's statement, whether intentional or not, had reopened questions Meghan thought were fading from the public conversation. Did she mishandle her role? Did she understand the expectations placed on her? Was she ever fully invested in the royal family, or simply passing through? And most damaging of all, was she more divisive than transformative? In the days that followed, Meghan reportedly monitored the public response obsessively. Her communications team tracked online sentiment, media coverage, and influencer commentary. And what they found wasn't encouraging. Public reaction was mixed, yes, but far from one-sided. In the UK, especially among traditional royalists, Zara's words struck a nerve. Pundits and columnists praised her for saying what palace officials couldn't. Royal watchers called it a long-overdue reckoning. Across social media, support for Zara surged. Even among younger demographics, Zara's authenticity was viewed as refreshing, an alternative to the polished, PR-driven messaging of both Meghan and the palace. In the US, Meghan's core base of supporters rallied behind her, calling Zara's statement another example of royal bullying. Prominent figures in Hollywood and progressive media defended Meghan, reiterating the trauma she had endured and praising her for leaving a toxic institution. But the balance was shifting. What once would have ignited overwhelming sympathy for Meghan now sparked debate. People weren't just defending or attacking. They were asking questions, rethinking loyalties, reevaluating the once clear dichotomy of victim and villain. Meghan could feel it. Behind her walls, surrounded by loyal staff, she still had power. But power built on sympathy was fragile, and Zara had cracked the foundation. Still, Meghan wasn't about to fold. She had built too much, lost too much, to retreat now. Instead, she pivoted. She began instructing her team to double down on her public projects, increase promotion for her lifestyle brand, refocus the media cycle on positivity and motherhood, quietly prep a new initiative tied to community empowerment. Control the narrative, she said more than once. But something had changed. For the first time since stepping into the royal spotlight, Meghan was on the defensive not because of a scandal, but because of a reputation shift. And the most painful part? She couldn't stop it. Because it hadn't come from the press. It had come from family. Meghan's world had been shaped by appearances, carefully managed interviews, and curated authenticity. Zara had cut through all of that with one sentence. No fanfare. No manipulation. Just a flat, firm opinion. And for Meghan, that was a new kind of threat. One she couldn't control. One she couldn't predict. One that would now live on in headlines, on social media, and in the collective memory of royal watchers everywhere. She didn't respond publicly. She didn't challenge Zara. But she did something far more telling. She changed course. And for someone as image-conscious and narrative-driven as Meghan Markle, that may have been the clearest sign of impact yet. By the end of the week, Zara Tindall's quiet but pointed declaration had become a digital wildfire. The podcast clip, originally posted on a modest rugby-centered YouTube channel, had skyrocketed across platforms in a way no one, perhaps not even Zara or Mike, had anticipated. What began as a restrained moment of honesty and a casual conversation had now transformed into one of the most explosive royal soundbites in recent memory. The internet was ablaze. On Twitter, or X, as it had since been rebranded, hashtags surged by the hour. Hashtag Zara tells truth. Hashtag failure to the royals. Hashtag Sussex reckoning. Hashtag finally someone said it. Within 48 hours, clips of Zara's statement had been reposted by every major news outlet, royal commentary page, and reaction channel. TikTok creators from both sides of the Atlantic began dissecting her tone, analyzing her word choice, and offering split-screen reactions filled with stunned silence, smirks, or outright applause. On YouTube, dozens of commentary videos labeled things like Zara destroys Meghan on air, or the royals strike back. What Zara just did clocked millions of views. Meme culture jumped in with lightning speed. Images of Zara in sunglasses, mock Time magazine Person of the Year covers, even satirical videos portraying her as a no-nonsense courtroom judge ruling on royal family drama. But amid the satire and spectacle, real discussion had begun to take root. Zara's words, simple as they were, gave people permission to re-examine a subject that had long felt radioactive. For years, criticism of Meghan Markle had been bundled with questions of race, colonialism, media ethics, and institutional bias. Those issues weren't erased, but Zara's intervention reframed the debate. This wasn't about skin color. It wasn't about old guard versus new blood. It was about behavior, legacy, and contribution. Zara hadn't spoken like a palace official. She'd spoken like a family member. And that made it personal. Public opinion started to shift, not in a single direction, but in 100 fractured lines. In the UK, where many still regard the monarchy with reverence, Zara's statement struck a national chord. Online forums exploded with praise. Finally, one commenter wrote on the Daily Mail's website, "Someone from the inside has the courage to say what we've all seen for years." On Facebook, Posts from royal fan pages earned thousands of shares and comments agreeing that Meghan's time with the firm had been more damaging than progressive. Older generations in particular, those who had followed the royal family since the Diana years, viewed Zara's comments as overdue justice. "I never thought I'd see the day," one woman wrote in a BBC comment thread. "Zara was always quiet. If she's speaking, it means she's fed up." But not all voices were in agreement. Across Instagram, threads in support of Meghan began trending. Influencers and activists rallied behind her, denouncing Zara's comments as misguided, unfair, and a betrayal of sisterhood. One post by a high-profile American activist read, "When women tear other women down publicly for daring to speak their truth, we all lose." Meghan told her story. Zara didn't like it. That doesn't mean Meghan failed. It means she scared people. Younger users, especially in the US and Canada, responded with caution. Many acknowledged that Zara had a right to her perspective but felt the timing and medium were wrong. "This isn't how families resolve problems," a trending Reddit comment read. "And airing dirty laundry on a podcast just makes everyone look bad." Still, even among Meghan's defenders, something had shifted. There was a growing acknowledgement, even among her most loyal supporters, that not everything had gone right during her time as a working royal. The idea of Meghan being misunderstood was still strong, but the framing of her as completely faultless began to waver. Zara's words had introduced a new variable: accountability. In royal circles, especially among royal watchers and journalists who had spent years documenting palace tensions, Zara's quote was a goldmine. Longtime royal correspondents such as Valentine Lowe and Camilla Tominey began appearing on television panels and morning shows, dissecting the fallout. "What makes this moment so important," one expert said on Sky News, "is that it didn't come from the establishment. It came from within the bloodline. Zara isn't daughter. She's part of the Queen's direct legacy. She doesn't have a press office. She doesn't want fame. So if she's talking, listen." BBC Radio 4 ran a panel discussion titled "Royal Silence Broken: The New Age of Speaking Out," where panelists debated whether Zara's statement would mark a new era of unfiltered honesty from royals who were once trained to stay quiet at all costs. Meanwhile, American late-night hosts had a field day. Stephen Colbert jokingly called the moment an episode of The Crown meets Mean Girls. Jimmy Fallon made a mock ad for a fictional reality show titled The Royal Rumble, Podcast Edition. Even Saturday Night Live jumped in, staging a skit where cast members portrayed royals recording a podcast, whispering royal family secrets into vintage microphones. But beneath the comedy and clamor, something deeper was occurring, a shift in perception. For so long, the Meghan versus royal family debate had been driven by abstract narratives: monarchy versus modernity, tradition versus individuality, British establishment versus American independence. Now, it was about something simpler: human behavior, choices, consequences. Zara's comment distilled years of tension into one devastating sentence. And in doing so, it forced the public to ask hard questions. Had Meghan truly tried to integrate, or had she been resistant from the start? Were her criticisms valid or exaggerated for effect? Did her departure heal the monarchy or leave deeper wounds? As the online debate raged, journalists and think pieces explored these angles with renewed intensity. Podcasts dedicated entire episodes to unpacking Zara's phrasing. Was failure too harsh? Was it justified? Was it long overdue? Amid the storm, one thing became clear: Meghan was no longer just a media figure. She was now the subject of royal judgment, raw, unscripted, and viral. And Zara, previously viewed as the quiet cousin, had become the unexpected voice of the monarchy's collective fatigue. Back on social media, polls emerged by the hundreds. Who do you side with? Zara or Meghan? Thousands of votes poured in. Some heavily favored Zara. Others rallied behind Meghan. But very few chose neutral. The line had been drawn. Ironically, Zara never posted a word. There was no Instagram story, no tweet, no clarification. Mike's podcast didn't release a follow-up statement. No apology. No elaboration. And that, too, spoke volumes. The message was clear. The comment was intentional, considered, and final. As the media storm intensified, the digital world continued to buzz with reaction, analysis, and division. But somewhere, in the background of the noise, was a growing realization: this wasn't just about Meghan or Zara anymore. This was about how the royal family would move forward in an age where silence is no longer sustainable and speaking up carries consequences. The public had taken sides. and the monarchy would have to deal with what came next.